Is pride a good thing? Yes and no. Welcome to week 26 of the Objectivism Book Study. I'm Cody Leibold. We are in chapter 8 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, reading pages 303 to 324. Today we're looking at Ayn Rand's understanding of pride as a virtue, and we'll compare this idea with Christian teaching. After that discussion, we're going to look at one major vice that Rand and Peikoff consider worthy of special investigation, the initiation of physical force. That is an ethical topic, and it becomes a key idea within Ayn Rand's political theory. On the final of the virtues that Rand discusses, what is pride? Take a look at the Oxford English Dictionary. It defines it as the quality of having an excessively high opinion of oneself or one's importance. In that definition, it would not be a virtue. Some other definitions. This is from Richard Taylor, the justified love of oneself. This is from Augustine, the love of one's own excellence. So you notice that we have quite a spectrum there. One of them necessarily defines it as not a virtue. One necessarily defines it as justified, so it's a virtue. And then in Augustine's definition, it's just the love of one's excellence, which is non-value based. You have to understand it can be used in all these different ways. A positive or negative or no value judgment on it. It depends on the context. Now, in Rand's view, pride is the commitment to achieve one's own moral perfection. That's striking because look how similar that is to what Jesus says in Matthew 5:48. You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Seeking perfection or to be mature, that's what it means. So Jesus teaches us that we should be mature, that we should become perfected. And Ayn Rand would also hold that you should have a commitment to achieve your own moral perfection. So now somebody could look at that, they could have a critical eye about that idea. They could say, well, now, it's ridiculous to think that you could become morally perfect. But then what is Jesus teaching? So there has to be some nuance here. Most people would accept that there is at least some kind of pride that's good. If you're on a football team, you should have pride in your team. If somebody is refusing to do work, you might give them advice. You might say, hey, have some pride. Take some pride in your own life. So there's that kind of pride that almost everybody would acknowledge. You need to have some kind of pride. Almost everybody would also acknowledge that there is a foolish pride, the braggart, the person who's boastful. We have a word for foolish pride. The word is hubris. That would, by definition, mean excessive pride. And we can contrast that kind of pride, the hubris pride, with humility. Now, humility is also a contentious topic, and it's one that comes up a lot more in the teaching of Christianity, as opposed to in the work of Ayn Rand. You're not going to have her listing humility as a virtue. But in Christianity, they would say, yes, it's a virtue. Rand, because of the kind of project that she set out on, she didn't talk a huge amount about humility because she disagreed with Christianity, at least the kind of Christian teaching or the assumptions about Christianity that she was exposed to. And that was largely focused on the diminishing of man. Anything that would make man lower in terms of how he thought of his own mind, about how he thought about his own motives. And so she was fighting against this diminishing of man. And I think, as we've seen in the previous discussions, that she had some appropriate concerns about that topic. So she tried to praise the heroic in man. And she rejected one particular common medieval vision of man, especially from the religious view in the Middle Ages, which is that man is basically weak, helpless, lacking in dignity. And she thinks, no, that's not true. Now, as Christians looking at this, looking at the history of Christian thought, we may also, in some ways, agree with the medieval view, and in some ways disagree with it. This is complicated. What is your vision of man? Ayn Rand would attribute much that she saw in the 20th century of the anti-life attitude and the anti-survival attitude, ultimately as being an anti-man attitude. And she thought that Christianity was a negative influence on that issue. So let's see what Rand's view is, and let's see where Christians might agree or might disagree. As I pointed out, pride is the commitment to achieve one's moral perfection, writes Rand. Man faces two corollary independent fields of action, in which a constant exercise of choice and a constant creative process are demanded of him, the world around him and his own soul. Just as he has to produce the material values he needs to sustain his life, he has to acquire the values of character that enable him to sustain it and to make his life worth living. So as we read through Rand's perspective, ask yourself, is there something about this that is indeed true? Is it the case that in order to survive on Earth, that we need to have some kind of perspective that says my life is worth pursuing and worth establishing. I mean, could you prosper without that? Go to the bottom of this page. We're on page 303. A proud man, writes Peikoff, struggles to achieve within himself the best possible spiritual state. So if I ever, for example, had a son who was a teenager, and I say to him, have some pride, I mean, think about your spiritual state. That's what I'm saying. In regard to morality, nothing less than perfection will do. Now that goes against the spirit of what is taught in most churches today. I mean, we typically are taught in churches that to even seek perfection would be a ridiculous idea. But I mean, if you hear that in a church, that church doesn't really understand Matthew chapter 5. Going on, since all virtues are forms of rationality, the commitment to achieve moral perfection reduces ultimately to a single policy, the commitment to follow reason. So in Peikoff's view, these are the same. No moderation between vice and virtue. Be rational. Be black and white in your thinking. Those all go together. No middle ground. Rand writes, moral perfection is an unbreached rationality. Not the degree of your intelligence, but the full and relentless use of your mind. Not the extent of your knowledge, but the acceptance of reason as an absolute. To be perfect, in Rand's view, does not mean to be omniscient. They're not the same thing. Rather, it is an unbreached commitment. A commitment to reason. Perfection so conceived is not only possible, but also necessary. It is necessary to a person for the same reason that a code of morality is necessary. If man's life is the standard by reference to which virtue is defined, then vice is not a temptation or a tolerable option, but a mortal threat. Moral imperfection in any area means movement toward destruction. So moral perfection, if you understand what she means by perfection here, you'll see that actually she's talking about something that is reasonable, and it is possible to man, at least broadly speaking. Moral concepts, writes Peikoff, including right, good, and perfect, are norms formulated to guide human choice. Such concepts can refer only to that which is within the power of choice. The broader principle here is that where there is no ability, you cannot ascribe responsibility.
It might be nice to talk about that because there's an idea, especially in Augustinian Christianity, God command what you will and grant what you command. And he disagreed in his context with the idea that the command that you ought to do something implies that you can do it. But of course, this brings us back to the topic that we've discussed before, which is the difference between a moral inability and a natural inability. All the discussions we've had on that address that topic. But I just wanted to bring it up because someone watching might infer that we believe that a person by his own effort, if you just put enough effort in, you can achieve perfection apart from the blood of Christ and without the Holy Spirit, which is not what any of us believe. But I think it is still true that perfection, moral perfection, does not require something other than human nature. It just requires a complete, restored human nature.
Yes, that has to be the case because Jesus Christ, when he was living on earth 2,000 years ago, he had human nature and he did not have the sin nature, and he fulfilled the law perfectly. To the extent that we simply have a human nature, we are capable of choice. I'm speaking of ability in the broadest sense, not the moral ability or inability. So we do distinguish between those things. We hold somebody responsible for what they loved. And when somebody loves wickedness, we call that a moral problem, but not a natural problem. Further discussion on that before we go forward? Broadly speaking, people have the ability to do right or to do wrong, to choose right or wrong, to choose to be rational or not. That's as far as the statements go. We're not saying anything about whether or not people are born with a sin nature and an inclination toward evil. Self-responsibility is the issue here. We're on the bottom of 304. He refuses to rest content with a defective soul. It's something that we have to be careful about within Christianity because Christianity teaches that because we are born in Adam, we have inherited a sin nature from Adam. We actually do believe that there is something about our desires that has been corrupted. We actually do believe we have an inclination to sin, and we see this empirically, that every person does sin. Even in light of that fact, we as Christians should be able to agree with Peikoff here. We're not going to say, oh, well then I guess that's just the way things are, and that's just fine. We are not allowed morally to be okay with this position. It says this moral person should refuse to rest content with a defective soul, shrugging and self-deprecation. That's me. He knows that me was created and is alterable by him. Now, integrating this with God's sovereignty and that whole field of discussion is not supposed to be easy, and that's not necessarily what we're doing here. But what we are doing is acknowledging that in at least some sense it is true that you create your own soul by your own choices. Go ahead, Andrew.
I found some verses from the Psalms that don't give a full explanation of the integration that you're talking about, Cody, because it is very hard, but they should at least give listeners who are skeptical a clue that that integration is necessary and desirable. 139:23 says, and 24, search me, O God, and know my heart, try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me. And elsewhere, Psalm 26, vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity, and I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. Prove me, O Lord, and try me, test my heart and my mind. I don't think we should take that to think that David thought that he had never committed sin. But it certainly shows that what David wanted was vindication, that he had done the right thing in his soul, that he wanted the knowledge that he had walked with integrity. And if you read those verses in context, he gives God credit for his obedience. But still, I think that's at least a clue that the author of those Psalms, I'm thinking to David, wanted that, desired that self-evaluation. And we'll get more into self-esteem as we go, but I think there's at least a hint that that's a biblical idea.
That's great. Was that Psalm 139 you said?
Yeah, and the other is from 26.
So Peikoff writes that the essence of pride is moral ambitiousness. Interesting, because within Christianity and within Western culture, there is ambivalence, whether the idea of ambition is good. We have in Shakespeare, flee ambition by this sin the devils fell. We have a concern that ambition could be potentially dangerous. It's also within Greek mythology. Many of the myths involve some human being thinking that they could rise to be more like the gods, and they call that the sin of hubris. It's also even contained within the narrative, which I believe is a historical narrative, about Adam and Eve, and their temptation was to be like God. So ambition, is ambition good? But the Christian has to say yes, if Jesus' teaching is to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. It's not so simple as ambition is bad. Next couple of pages, we see they're rejecting the view of Immanuel Kant, which they say has rewritten reality, which is, in Kant's view, moral perfection is out of the question. Kant demands that people act virtuously in a way that is devoid of personal motive. You could also see the Stoics doing something kind of like that. They end up condemning human beings for the act of existing, and these are primacy of consciousness approaches. We don't have to go into great detail about that, but the problem is making people have unearned guilt. And when you try to convince people that they have some kind of unearned guilt, or you make them accept guilt irrationally, where there is none, then you own them. Whatever you say, they'll listen to you. That's a common theme within the fiction of Ayn Rand. Peikoff writes here, the moral man does not undercut his character by accepting unearned guilt. So that's an important point. But then what happens when you actually do something wrong? Peikoff addresses that. He says, let's say somebody does earn moral guilt. Then in that case, you have to act decisively to clean the slate, restore your moral purity. Now it's interesting because within Christianity, we have only one solution for how to restore moral purity, and that is the blood of Jesus Christ on the cross shed for his elect. Within the frame of reference of objectivism, restoring moral purity would mean reforming yourself, which, as we know just from observation, people can do to a degree. Moral reform is possible. So I don't disagree with Peikoff here, but there's more to say about that within Christianity, isn't there? So Peikoff talks about trying to restore your moral purity. So then what that would mean, and this is true within Christianity as well, is that part of restoring yourself would be denouncing what you did. It would be condemning the improper behavior and figuring out why you did it, like what was the actual sin, what was the wrong idea, the false idea that you were holding, and then making reparation where applicable. That's certainly Christian, is to make a reparation if you have stolen something or damaged something. And then he says, work to reshape your mental policy. and thereby you restrain your character in the future. And that's all consistent with what you see in the Old Testament and New Testament in Christianity. Moving forward, the man of pride despises the morally gray. So he's not selective about which virtues he's going to inculcate in himself. He observes every moral principle on principle. And so being principled on principle, actually, that's a lot like integrity if you think back to a couple weeks ago. The principle of being principled. Here it's also related to pride. So Ayn Rand describes pride as the sum of all virtues. It's similar to Aristotle, who called it the crown. You can't have pride until you have all the other virtues. Pride is acknowledging your own value, which means you have to have the value in place. Bottom of this page 305. Pride leads man to this value that Rand calls one of the supreme values, self-esteem. Unbreached rationality produces self-confidence in a man. Since his policy is to recognize reality, he has a sense of efficacy, a conviction of his power to deal with reality and achieve his goals. In addition, the moral character he creates is admirable. So the proud man has a sense of his own worth. This sense includes the feeling that he has a right to be the beneficiary of his actions, that he is entitled to the intention which self-sustenance demands, that he has earned the position of being his own highest value. Now that last phrase, that raises some question marks. Your own highest value. As a Christian, we are commanded that we are to love God with all of our heart, soul, strength, mind. That we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, which suggests that there's a different level of love that you have for your own life versus for God. I think that it is self-interested to consider God as being more important than me, because if you just look at it, what am I? What is God? He is a more important being than me. He is perfect. And he's the one that was from the beginning and that gave me life and that continues to be the foundation of my very existence. And so I love him because I love myself, and I consider him and whatever is good for him to be the highest value. But when you get into the discussion about rational egoism, rational self-interest, this is where I think this is maybe the last piece of the puzzle that Christians have a very difficult time looking at Rand's claims and resolving them with what Christianity says, because we have this perspective that says you should love God most. You should love God more than yourself. Now, to understand that, as we looked at in the past, the answer is to say, well, I have to be able to say I. To be able to say, I love you. When I say love, I mean you are my highest interest. Whatever you are my highest interest. I would say that God is my highest value. I'm not going to follow Rand in this statement here, that I would say that I am my highest value. I would almost just say that the idea of saying I in this context is a different sort of a question than saying whether being in good shape, having a career, having a marriage, having children, God, those are all different categories from me. Because to even have a value at all is this pre-value issue of your own life is the standard of valuing all those other things. And so the way I look at it, my life is the standard of value, but in the hierarchy of values on which my life depends, God is the highest. So he's just in a different category from myself. I cannot compare the value of my life to the value of God, the value of my wife, those other things. That's how I would answer it in a way that I think is more consistent with Christianity. Any reactions to that?
I have a lead on what I want to study more after this. This is prompting a thought. A concept that I come across in the New Testament a lot is the word godliness. There's a Greek word that gets translated that way, and I want to do a study of that because I think if there's any word that's closest to this objectivist understanding of pride, it might be this. I'm not sure. It's a hypothesis. But here is a perfect juxtaposition at the end of 1 Timothy. Paul is warning Timothy about people who are heretics. And he says, these people imagine that godliness is a means of gain, period. He says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. There are people who say, oh, this God character, whatever, they don't have any actual personal value for him. He is a means of getting the gain, which they think is money, because they're saying that the money for them is higher than God, right? But he says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. So how can you say that there's great gain without a person valuing what is being gained? I think that's important. And I think that that's something that I would like to research more.
I agree. It sounds like they've misconceptualized what gain could include, like they've limited it too much to material. We go to the next section. Self-esteem in this case is thinking that you are somebody that is admirable. If you were to distinguish between pride and self-esteem, I would say that pride comes first and then self-esteem. Pride is the determination that you are going to take good care of your own soul. And then self-esteem is the evaluation that your own soul is admirable or worthy. So for example, to clarify, in that case where, let's say there's a lazy bum and you tell them you need to take some pride in yourself, somebody who is currently not admirable could decide to take pride in themselves. This is just one way of using these terms. I'm not going to fight over it, but the point is that you could decide to have some pride even when you have no self-esteem. You could make a decision to have some pride, and that pride is an attitude about taking care of yourself. After some time has gone by, you develop the self-esteem that comes from actually having seen yourself succeed. That's how I tend to use those things. I wouldn't say have some self-esteem to somebody who is not admirable. That would seem to be contradictory. Why would you? It would be irrational. But you could have some pride. Next part, I can achieve the best, I deserve the best, I can achieve, I'm able to live, I am worthy of living. To some extent, in order to move forward, you need to have those ideas, but it's very complicated. From the point of view of a Christian, I'm going to say, you're not going to get very far on this. You're not going to have a very integrated sense of self-esteem unless what you really mean is that Christ living in me is making me worthy. There is a power there because it's rational, whereas I think that the objectivists that are lacking the power of Christ in their life, his forgiveness, his transforming, then they're going to have to overlook evidence that says that they are not morally admirable. They're overlooking key facts. They're able to move forward and have a pretty good life, but nothing close to what a Christian can have.
This is where I wanted to jump in, Cody, and do a quick summary of an idea that pops up in the Romantic Manifesto, which is Ayn Rand's book about art. But she uses this idea to illustrate her concept of the sense of life. So I'm just going to skim this. I'm not going to go too long. She says that religion is a primitive form of philosophy, but many of its myths are distorted, dramatized allegories based on some element of truth. And one such idea is the myth of the supernatural recorder from whom nothing can be hidden, who lists all of a man's deeds, the good and the evil, and who confronts a man with that record on Judgment Day. That myth is true, not existentially, but psychologically. And she says that's a person's subconscious. She said that's a religious myth of the subconscious. And then she basically says, to the extent that you're virtuous on her understanding of virtue, your sense of life will be positive, the benevolent universe. But to the extent that you are evasive, your sense of life will be death, doom, gloom, fear. And I want to know, on objectivism's own terms, could a person even have a clean slate sense of life purely? Or I think we have to say it because especially we affirm natural theology and this understanding that even the unregenerate have a clear idea open to them of what truth is. I think we'd have to say, even on their own terms, this positive verdict that she speaks of in the middle of page 306 that Peikoff speaks of, meaning a positive verdict of one's own moral character, I don't think that's possible. I think, like you said, you can get a pretty good idea, say, I'm pretty good. And I really respect objectivists for saying and holding the idea that moral perfection is necessary. I don't think they can really have that. I think there's evasion that has to be done in order to get there, or to think that just because I've stopped this bad habit that I'm morally pure. I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think that there's a way that they can frame it to where they can get themselves that?
There is evasion going on, and I also think that it's a problem of standards. Because if they don't have God's standards, if they don't believe the Ten Commandments, for example, and other things that you see in Romans 1, like objectivists don't agree with some of those sins that are listed in Romans 1, do they? They have wrong standards, and so they're measuring themselves the way a cheater measures himself. That's part of it. Even within their framework, they still have access to facts that they have to evade. Okay, so he talks about you need to have this positive verdict about your own character, and that gives you strength, which is true. Now we go to this next section. He says, a negative verdict, whether it takes the form of self-doubt, self-hatred, it's a punishment for having lived out of focus, and it turns one into a spiritual cripple who spends his time primarily not on pursuing goals, but on trying to cope with fear and guilt. Well, I get the sense that there's a lot of people in the world that are like this, especially in the United States today, where just a lot of what they do with their time seems like it's a response to the psychological need to cope with your own fear, your own guilt. I think that a lot of health problems and a lot of irrationality, and in fact a lot of political activism, has to do with this overall negative verdict that people have on themselves. I think that's what's driving it. He points out that these people feel fear, and Rand says because they have abandoned their weapon of survival, and they feel guilt because they know that they've done it volitionally. So we go to the next section. A volitional being cannot accept self-preservation as his purpose. Unless taking a moral inventory, he concludes that he is qualified for the task, qualified in terms of ability and value. Now, this is so useful if you're a parent to try to help your children come to this conclusion that their life is of value and that they are up to the task of learning the rules, following them. They're up to the task of learning how to do things that are difficult. You can do hard things. That's a message that people need to hear. You have it in you. You have what it takes. They need to hear that. They don't naturally believe that, but they need to learn that it's true over time. Top of 307. Since the self is the mind, self-esteem is mind esteem. In Rand's definition, it is a reliance on one's power to think, the commitment to consciousness. It's the directly volitional function of man. Such a commitment is the source of human efficacy and personal worth. And so if you're trying to figure out, how can you tell somebody or yourself that you are up to this challenge, that you have what it takes, you just point to this issue of the mind. You say, are you paying attention to reality? Do you care about what's true? If yes, then you have what it takes to learn. You'll make errors, but you will learn it eventually. Rand is asking us, or telling us, judge yourself as good or evil, hold yourself in esteem or contempt by reference to a single criterion, your volitional use or misuse of your tool of survival. Let's compare that to Christianity. Well, within Christianity, no one is going to be rational and oriented toward the truth in the fullest extent until they have become regenerate, until they have placed their faith in Jesus Christ. Christianity is going to look at any of these objectivists that say that I definitely use my tool of survival well. We'll say you simply don't. Next material, contrast this approach with the second-hander. The second-hander judges their soul by improper standards. They pit the requirements of their self-esteem against the requirements of their life. Because I'm going to say that I have self-esteem because I conform to other people's claims, but the requirements of your life are that you conform to reality. So that's the problem. Now, Rand describes such a practice as setting one's self-esteem against reality, which is horrible and insightful. Okay, on page 308, he must learn to judge himself, not by his relation to others, nor by his knowledge or existential success, but by his maintenance of a certain mental state, one that depends on nothing but his own will, the state of being in full focus. This concept of being in full focus is key to the objectivist sense of your ethics and how you prosper. Now, when you're a kid, when you're a young kid, maybe 8 years old, 12 years old, one of the things that is probably true is that you're not in a state of full focus because you just have so much information coming in and you don't know how. You haven't learned to discipline your mind. And this is the difference between somebody who is immature and somebody who is mature, is that they can know when it is required of them that they be in focus. If a young kid starts to walk into the street and doesn't look, we don't necessarily expect that he would have had this discipline, but now is the time to teach him. Because until he learns it, then he is not ready for life in this world, at least not unsupervised. Pride and self-esteem are open to everyone is a point from objectivism. I agree, especially pride, and then eventually self-esteem, as long as you continue to follow what is needed. Peikoff writes, in our culture, every moral requirement of intelligence is relentlessly attacked. Rationality is castigated as heartless, intellectuality as arid, egoism as exploitative. Independence as antisocial, integrity as rigid, honesty as impractical, justice as cruel, productiveness as materialistic. And the sum of this approach, the crown of the creed of death worship, is the tenet that pride is evil. Quite a statement there, and that's true. That accounts for the state of our society today, is how people have falsely attributed disvalues to all of these virtues. Peikoff writes, if people believe that they should not aspire to be perfect, that self-esteem is a delusion, and virtue consists in recognizing how vicious they are, then true virtue is impossible to them, and the trap is closed to the human race. So the better men will give up the exacting ambition to be good, and the rest give up any hope of reform, and the result is a mass manufacture of despair. The despair takes the form of species-wide self-abasement, centuries-long rule of immorality. Only a corrupt theory of morality can produce such a rule. Now, I agree with that. There is a problem with not recognizing pride as a virtue. But then Peikoff goes on and he says that one of the reasons historically why we have this concept is the idea of original sin. Okay, so to some extent he could be right, that there are some misapplications of the doctrine of original sin that have led to this. But the biblical doctrine itself is only the doctrine that Adam and Eve sinned and that we are under Adam's headship. Whatever consequences Adam took, they accrue to the rest of humanity. And there are effects of his sin on us in some way, which you can see in several passages. I think in 1 Corinthians and maybe in Romans, there's several times where it describes this, that we are in Adam. This does not mean that we are not capable of doing what God requires of us. The Christian view is that we are only capable of doing it ultimately by faith. We're only capable of doing it because we have believed in the gospel. And even before the time of Jesus, people were capable of following God because of institutions that he set up for ancient Israel. They were capable of following God, basically placing their faith in Jesus before Jesus even had lived, because they were placing their faith in God's promise that there would be that Savior. We think that there is a way that you can have pride, a positive assessment of yourself. We don't think that you have to embrace this idea that man should damn himself. Go ahead, Jacob.
Something that a lot of, especially Reformed Christians, but Christians in general, don't get is that the reason that we have the kind of Gnostic pietism in the church that we have is oftentimes because we fail to make these distinctions, like between man's moral inability and his natural inability. Even Reformed people, they will say, yes, God is sovereign and humans have responsibility. They'll affirm both pieces. But without integrating both pieces, without understanding how they relate to each other, which they refuse to do, without doing that integration, you're merely affirming that man is responsible. But the corollary of man being responsible is that man is efficacious in certain respects, that he is a causal agent in certain respects. They don't want to affirm all of those things. And a lot of the reason why is because they think that all of those things are contrary to God's sovereignty in some way.
One comment from Isaac that he had written, I'm just going to read it. He says, pride is like taking your gold crown and cleaning it so that it shines brighter. Those who worship death, the anti-intellectuals, will see that person cleaning their gold crown and decry, prideful. Don't you realize that you're making people jealous? Not everyone has what you have. You should be ashamed of your arrogance. Those who love life, who focus, who affirm the importance of morality, thinking, and being rational will see and respond, I want a crown to shine like that. So two different approaches, the envious approach versus simply the rational, reality-oriented approach. Now, this next paragraph from Peikoff, I'd say it's just not very good. He says that there's no place in ethics for the idea of humility as a virtue. And I'm thinking, it's not a very serious engagement. We could do better. Let's talk about humility as a virtue. I've got a quote from C.S. Lewis. He says, according to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Okay, so there is something to that. There was pride going on in Satan's motivation and in Eve's when they turned away from God. Now, I wouldn't characterize their fall, both of them, as fundamentally a matter of pride. Rather, I would characterize it as fundamentally a matter of irrationality, evasion, not being truth-oriented. They put an I wish above an it is. But that resulted in them making an arrogant choice to arrogate to themselves something that did not belong to themselves. And so we see this biblical principle from Proverbs 11:2, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble there is wisdom. We see in Proverbs 16, everyone who is arrogant in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Be assured he will not go unpunished. Pride goes before destruction, it says later in that same chapter. A haughty spirit before a fall. We know in 1 Corinthians and the rest of the New Testament, we have to be humble, not prideful, in the negative sense of that word. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant. Humble yourselves before the Lord, says James 4. He will exalt you. Galatians 6:4. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. Oh, wait. That just said boast, didn't it? Okay, so there's a lot of nuance here. A lot. We know that we should humble ourselves before the Lord, and we also know that it's okay to boast if your boasting is reasonable, if you have a reason to boast. It talks about testing your own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone. So whatever else the Christians may say against what we're proclaiming here, The Bible does teach that the reason that you boast should be, in this context, in yourself. Not an easy thing.
I think it's helpful to think of both the virtue of pride and the virtue of humility as being two sides of the same coin, where the coin is thinking accurately about yourself. And the virtue of pride would be thinking accurately, positively about yourself, having an accurately positive self-evaluation. And humility would be having an accurately negative self-evaluation. Usually the virtue of humility in the Bible is speaking about our relationship to God. And of course, if you're going to be reason-oriented and rational, then your evaluation of yourself in relation to God is going to be appropriately low.
Your connection to God is the key issue here for evaluating it. So, for example, Proverbs says, do you see a man who is wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than him. But then we also see in 2 Corinthians, Paul, who is not a fool, who is doing the work of God, says, I have great pride in you. I'm filled with comfort. In all our affliction, I'm overflowing with joy. He has pride in the work that God is doing through him, but it's ultimately pride in what God is doing. Compare that to Nebuchadnezzar, who had no place for the role of God, and when his heart was lifted up in Daniel 5, his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly. He was brought down from his kingly throne. Any comments about that?
The negative kind of pride, the sinful kind of pride, is often a lust to be seen as great in the eyes of others. It's a very second-handed type thing, which obviously objectivism rejects as irrational and evil. And a lot of times that's what people mean when they talk about the sin of pride. They mean the need or the desire to be seen as great by other people. And that is the opposite of what Rand and Peikoff are advocating for here and what we are advocating for here, because we're not talking about, we don't care about what other people think of us. And that ought to be your attitude, a certain extent of disregard for the opinions of others, but a supreme regard for God's opinion of you, and a desire to have your own opinion match God's opinion of you as much as possible, which means allowing God to make the final public determination. You don't care to have it be made public what your actual evaluation ought to be to other people, apart from God making that public.
That's all outstanding. Now, in this next material from Peikoff, he points out this anecdote of a devout Catholic who is a relative of Ayn Rand's cheating on his own wife, trying to justify his behavior, saying, if I lived up to every tenet of my religion, I'd be guilty of a worse sin, the sin of pride. Now, I think that there may be some people that act that way. I think that there may be some people that, whether or not they're, doing something so wicked as having an affair, that they actually do think there's a major problem here with pride in your own thinking about yourself. You might justify some of your foibles or your actual sins by saying, well, I guess God is keeping me humble. This is just ridiculous. You ought to pursue a certain kind of pride. Now, you ought to also acknowledge your fallen nature. Don't celebrate it, and don't use it as a justification, and don't use this idea that pride is bad as a justification. That's just sophistry. Just think about this. He says, an ethics that extols humility is a self-contradiction. I mean, if what you mean is an ethics that says that mankind is not valuable and has no dignity, sure, then I'd agree with him. But he's not giving us the level of engagement that is necessary for us to really have an opinion about what he means here. He says that it is the advocacy of a code of behavior along with the demand not to practice it fully. Okay. Let's wrap up the discussion on pride I want to summarize what he says here. If an ethics urges intrinsicist dogmas, then men do need to find a loophole or breathing space from being ethical. They need to smuggle into their days some self-preserving behavior. If one upholds an ethics of life, however, he does not need to smuggle in any speck of the opposite. One does not need a breathing space from breathing. So as we see, ethics is one. Ethics is an integrated whole. We ought not to embrace this system of ethics that says it's full of contradictions, it's full of incoherencies or paradoxes. It's just not. There are things that are difficult to understand, but the more you learn, the more you ought to be able to say, I know. Not the opposite, the skeptic approach that says the more you learn, the more mystery there is. It's not the case. And if you're learning that way, and if that's your experience, then you've been doing it wrong. So let's go on to the next section here, the initiation of force as evil. And our discussion here will have to be shorter. It's actually It looks like 14 pages. Here's what I think we should do is just get a little bit of an introduction into this, and then we'll wrap up our video, and we won't actually get to go to the very end. So we are on page 310, the initiation of physical force as evil. Peikoff writes, this vice represents the antithesis and destruction of the virtue of rationality, and therefore of every other virtue. And so he says to initiate force is to commit a major evil. Physical force is coercion, exercised by physical agency, such as, among many other examples, by punching a man in the face, incarcerating him, shooting him, or seizing his property. Initiation means starting the use of force against innocent individuals. This idea of force, this does not mean something like, my boss fired me. Okay, so yeah, your boss forced you to go home. But he's talking about physical force, coercive physical force. We move on. The moralist has to tell men how to act when they disagree. Key point there. Your ethical theory is not complete until you've told people, what do you do when you disagree with other people? So the moralist has to tell men how to act when they disagree, assuming that people can't just always go separate ways and ignore each other the rest of their lives when they reach a disagreement. There's only going to be two methods that you can use to deal with a dispute, and the methods are either reason or force. That's it. So seeking to persuade other people of your ideas voluntarily, or if not that, then what else do you have at your disposal? And that's going to be some kind of coercion. Objectivism countenances only the method of persuasion. That is, unless the other person has initiated force, and then it countenances using force in a measured, objective, legal way in retaliation. We are all rational beings, and we are all going to expect each other to use our minds, and we're going to expect to relate by persuasion until someone initiates force, and then it's force in response. Because if you stopped acting like a rational being, you started acting like an animal, and now we must treat you according to the principle of justice. We must treat you as your identity requires. Top of 311, the man of force is attacking a person's body or seizing his property. He thereby negates and paralyzes the victim's mind. So they're going to explain the danger of initiation of force in terms of the effect on the mind. And some of this sounds a little odd because they'll tell you something like, when somebody initiates force against you, it makes it so that you cannot think. But they seem to walk it back a little bit because they say, well, yeah, you could think in the privacy of your mind, but you can't apply your thinking in action. And you no longer have any realm in your choice of actions to apply your thinking to. And so it becomes an exercise in futility. What's the best way to spend the money that you just got robbed from? Well, you no longer have any way to spend that money. You've taken away the ability to think in terms of what was yours. It no longer is an option to you. A rational mind, writes Ayn Rand, does not work under compulsion. It does not subordinate its grasp of reality to anyone's orders, directives, or controls. She writes that a gun is not an argument. Now, Peikoff writes, to order a man to accept a conclusion against his own judgment is to order him to accept as true something that, according to everything he knows, is not true. It's either arbitrary or false. This amounts to ordering him to believe a contradiction. It is like demanding his agreement that red is green or that 2 + 2 = 5, which ironically in the last year or so was a big debate on Twitter, whether 2 + 2 = 5. So bottom of 311, it is impossible for a man to engage in a cognitive undertaking or to reach a cognitive result such as an idea while brushing aside logic and reality. Yet, this is what the criminal who seeks to force a mind demands of his victim. The victim, therefore, has only one recourse, if he cannot escape, to cease functioning as a cognitive entity. When reality is decreed at gunpoint to be out of bounds, the rational mind has no way to proceed. This is a theme that comes up a lot in Atlas Shrugged. The climax of Atlas Shrugged says, let's take it seriously. What would happen if you tried to force a mind? Could the mind operate? Peikoff writes, this is why the greatest eras of human history have always been the freest. This is why science, art, invention, and every other expression of fresh human thought fail to arise or vanish in a dictatorship. We'll discuss this more in the coming weeks, but I think that this would be a good place to leave off in our discussion today. I want to say thank you, everybody, for watching the Objectivism Book Study and for doing the hard work, the granular work, to say where do we actually agree and disagree. This provides a foundation so that whatever For the New Christian Intellectual does in the future, we'll be able to say, well, we have put some thought into this or that. People can say, I'm concerned that you as a Christian take Ayn Rand seriously. And we can say, what exactly is the point of your concern? Because we've covered it. We've laid it out what we think and what we don't think. You can look and see. So this is partly creating a robust position statement for FT&CI. It's partly because we want to be able to have a foundation on which we can then say, we've already established where we land on this issue. Now we can advocate for a specific policy in regard to a current event and push people back to this. So what we have here is going to be a resource for years to come. It's also, hopefully, for those who have been intrigued by our way of thought, going to be a resource where people can say, this is where the sound philosophy actually is. We're not the only people that are advocating sound philosophy, but we certainly want there to be this kind of platform out there available to the world. By joining the discussion today, you guys are making that possible, and that's exciting. The world can be a better place. The world can change because of the work that we do as Christians, and especially the work that we do on intellectual issues, where we are seeking the truth and we're seeking it with all of our heart. That's what we're doing here. So if you'd like to get on an email list, go to christianintellectual.com/subscribe. If you'd like to join us live on these videos, go to christianintellectual.com/objectivism. And I will talk to you soon. God bless.